The sun bled red across the flat Texas horizon, painting the dusty rooftops of Redrock Flats in shades of copper and gold. It was the kind of evening that made a man feel small beneath the sky, the kind that reminded him that the land was old, indifferent, and vast beyond counting. But for the people of Redrock Flats, that particular evening felt alive with something warm, because Matthew 31 was riding home. You could hear it before you saw it, the slow, steady rhythm of hoofbeats on dry earth, unhurried and certain, like the man himself. Children pressed their faces against storefront windows. Old Hector, the blacksmith, set down his hammer and stepped out into the street, wiping his hands on his leather apron. Even Sheriff Dawes, a broad-shouldered man who feared very little, straightened up from his porch post and nodded with quiet respect. Matthew 31 was not the tallest man in the West, nor the loudest. He wore a weathered brown duster, a hat darkened by years of sun and rain, and boots that had crossed more ground than most men would see in 3 lifetimes. At his hip rested a single revolver, not worn for show, but carried with the solemn purpose of a man who understood the weight of it. He was 34 years old and had the eyes of someone twice that age, calm, watchful, and quietly kind. His reputation stretched from the Rio Grande to the Northern Territories, but the stories told about Matthew 31 were not the ordinary kind. They did not speak of bodies left in the dust or saloons shot to pieces. They spoke of a land dispute in Crimson Ridge, settled without a single shot fired, because Matthew sat with both sides for 3 hours and found an agreement neither had considered. They spoke of a family in Sagebrush Valley, protected from a gang of land thieves when Matthew rode in alone, spoke 6 measured words, and the thieves reconsidered entirely. He was feared not because he was reckless, but because he was absolutely certain, and there was nothing more dangerous in the West than a man who knew exactly what he stood for. But none of that, none of the legend or the miles or the reputation, meant as much to Matthew 31 as the woman who was waiting for him at the edge of town. Mindy stood at the white picket fence of the small schoolhouse she had made her own, her dark hair catching the evening breeze, a book pressed against her chest, and a smile on her face that could have stopped a storm. She was a schoolteacher by profession and a force of nature by character. The children of Redrock Flats adored her. Their parents trusted her with something more precious than gold. She had come to this town 3 years ago with nothing but a trunk of books and an unshakable belief that education could change the course of a life. And she had proven herself right, one lesson at a time. Matthew dismounted without ceremony, looped his reins over the fence post, and looked at her the way a man looks at something he is terrified of losing. "You're late," she said. "The canyon road washed out," he replied. "Had to ride around. You always have a reason." "I always come back." She stepped forward and took his hands in hers, studying the new lines of tiredness on his face with quiet concern. He let her look. With Mindy, Matthew had learned long ago that there was no use in pretending. She saw through people the way sunlight sees through water, cleanly, without effort. That evening, they sat on the porch of the small house Matthew had built for the two of them at the edge of town, eating a simple supper of cornbread and beans, while the stars came out one by one above the Texas plain. Mindy told him about the children, about the new reader she had ordered from back east, about how young Thomas Briggs had finally stopped putting spiders in the ink wells. Matthew listened with his full attention, not the distracted half-listening of a tired man, but the genuine, devoted listening of someone who understood that these small stories were the whole point. "One more ride," he told her quietly, as the fire inside burned low. "There's a land dispute 2 towns over in Colton Pass, families getting pushed off their property, sheriff there sent word." Mindy was quiet for a moment. In the firelight he could see her thinking it through, not with resentment but with the measured honesty that was simply part of who she was. "One more," she said finally, And then you hang that belt up for good. I promise you, Matthew said. And he meant it the way a man means something when he has thought it through to the bone. He rode out the following morning at sunrise. Mindy stood in the doorway of their home, watching until the dust of his trail dissolved into the pale blue distance. She pressed her hand briefly to the doorframe, said a quiet prayer, and turned back inside to prepare for her school day. She had no way of knowing that it would be 8 months before she saw him again. And she had no way of knowing that by the time he found her, she would be the one who had changed everything. The trail out of Colton Pass was cold by the time Matthew finished his work there. The land dispute had been settled, documents signed, families protected, the pushing stopped, but the ride home carried a different kind of weight entirely. The town of Redrock Flats came into view on a gray October afternoon, and Matthew rode in with the easy confidence of a man returning to everything that mattered. But Redrock Flats was not the town he had left. He felt it before he understood it, a stillness that sat wrong, like a song played in the wrong key. Porches that should have held neighbors held nobody. The schoolhouse windows were dark in the middle of the afternoon. Sheriff Dawes met him at the edge of town with a look on his face that Matthew had never seen there before, something caught between guilt and grief. "She's gone, Matthew," the sheriff said. No preamble, no softening. Just the truth, delivered the only way a decent man could deliver it. Harlan Voss had arrived 12 days after Matthew left. A land baron from the Eastern Territories, thick with money and thinner on conscience, Voss had been quietly buying influence across 3 counties. He wanted Redrock Flats, its water rights, its position along the new trade route, all of it. When the town resisted, he applied pressure the way men like him always did, slowly, legally on the surface, ruthless underneath. Mindy had refused to be quiet about it. She had organized meetings, written letters to the territorial office, and spoken plainly to anyone who would listen. Voss's men had shown up at the schoolhouse on a Tuesday morning and informed her, with cold politeness, that she was being relocated to a settlement called Greystone Creek in the Northern Territory. For her own safety, they said, with smiles that meant the opposite. Nobody in Redrock Flats knew exactly where Greystone Creek was. That, Matthew understood immediately, was entirely the point. He stood in the empty schoolhouse for a long time. The books were still on the shelves. A half-finished lesson remained chalked on the board in Mindy's careful handwriting. He pressed 2 fingers lightly against the chalk letters, then turned and walked back out into the cold air. He rode north before sunrise. The weeks that followed were among the hardest of Matthew's life, not because of danger, but because of silence. The open frontier has a particular kind of loneliness that gets inside a man when he is searching for something. The desert plains offered no answers. River crossing slowed him. Early mountain snow pushed him off the high passes and sent him winding through longer, lower routes that added days to every leg of the journey. He stopped at every town, every outpost, every lonely roadside inn between Texas and the Northern Territories. He described Mindy to strangers patiently, her dark hair, her precise way of speaking, the book she always carried. Most people shook their heads. A few pointed him in directions that led nowhere. Then, in a small river town called Palo Bend, he found old Tess. She ran a modest inn at the edge of town, a stout woman with silver hair and sharp eyes that missed absolutely nothing. When Matthew described Mindy, Tess set down her dishcloth, looked at him carefully and said, "Schoolteacher. Traveled through here about 2 months back." Sitting straight in that wagon like she was riding to a place she had chosen herself. She paused. She left something. It was a single page, folded small, a note Mindy had pressed into Tess's hand on the quiet, asking her to give it to any man matching Matthew's description who came asking. It said only, "Still north. Still standing. Don't stop." Matthew read it 3 times. Then he folded it carefully and placed it inside his coat, directly over his heart. In the weeks that followed, the trail grew warmer. A young deputy named Carlos, riding patrol near the northern border, had crossed paths with Mindy's group and shared 2 meals with the travelers. He joined Matthew for 3 days of riding, pointing out landmarks and confirming the route. He was 22 years old and full of the kind of idealism that the frontier hadn't yet worn down, and somewhere in his easy company Matthew felt something loosen in his chest, the rigid knot of fear that had lived there since October. Most moving of all were the settlers Mindy had apparently helped during the journey itself, families being relocated alongside her, frightened and uncertain. They described how she had organized their meals, settled disputes between exhausted travelers, taught the children lessons by firelight each evening, and refused to let despair take hold. They spoke of her the way people speak of someone who has fundamentally altered their understanding of what a person can be. She never cried once, an old settler woman told Matthew quietly. Not that we ever saw, she just kept saying, "He'll come. He always comes back." That night, Matthew sat beside a low campfire at the edge of the northern plain. He pulled the locket from his coat pocket, small, brass, worn smooth, and opened it. Mindy's portrait looked back at him, painted tiny and precise. He closed his hand around it, looked up at the enormous sky above him, and said a prayer that was mostly just her name, repeated quietly into the cold dark until sleep finally came. 6 weeks later, at a frontier post office in a nowhere town called Flat Rock Crossing, the postmaster handed him a letter. The handwriting on the envelope was unmistakable. Matthew sat down on the bench outside, turned the envelope over in his hands twice, and opened it slowly, the way a man opens something he wants to last. "Dear Matthew," it began. "Word reached me through a traveling preacher that you have been riding every road in the West looking for me. I believe it entirely. I want you to know that I am well, more than well if I am honest. I am in Greystone Creek. I built a school here, a real one, with 4 walls and a proper door, and a bell I found in a salvage pile outside of town. The children here needed someone and I happened to arrive. I have been busy. I am not going to tell you to hurry. I know you will. I am not going to tell you I have been afraid. I know you would worry. I will only tell you this. I'm not going anywhere, Matthew. Come find me when the road brings you here. I'll have supper on." Mindy. Matthew read it twice. Then he laughed, a full, genuine laugh that startled his horse and carried out across the empty plain with nothing to stop it for miles in any direction. He was back in the saddle before the echo settled. Greystone Creek announced itself quietly. No grand welcome sign, no church steeple visible from a distance. Just a thin trail of chimney smoke rising above a ridge of pine trees on a bright April morning. Matthew crested that ridge on horseback and pulled his reins gently, letting his horse settle while he took in the view below. He had expected hardship. He had ridden 8 months through desert, mountain, and frozen plain, carrying the image of Mindy as he last saw her, standing in a doorway, watching him leave. He had braced himself, without admitting it, for the possibility that what Voss's men had done to her spirit might not be fully visible in a letter. That survival and truly living were different things. That the woman he loved might have been diminished by what she had endured. What he saw stopped every one of those thoughts cold. Greystone Creek was alive. Not wealthy, not grand, but unmistakably, purposefully alive. Freshly mended fences lined the main path. A community well had been recently dug, its wooden frame still pale and new. A vegetable garden stretched along the southern edge of the settlement in neat, carefully tended rows, and at the center of it all, standing solid and proud with a small brass bell mounted above its door, was a schoolhouse, a real one. 4 walls, a proper roof, 2 windows with actual glass panes that caught the morning light and threw it back in clean, bright angles. Matthew rode down slowly. An older man repairing a fence post looked up, studied him briefly, and said without any particular fanfare, "You must be Matthew." "I must be," Matthew replied. The man set down his tools, extended a weathered hand, and shook Matthew's with the firm grip of someone who has built things. "She said you'd have that look about you. Like a man who just rode 1,000 miles and is trying not to show how tired he is." He smiled. "Name's Gerald. Come on, I'll walk you in." As they moved through the settlement, Gerald talked. Matthew listened the way he always listened, completely, carefully, missing nothing. The story that emerged was not the story of a woman who had endured. It was the story of a woman who had transformed. Mindy had arrived in Greystone Creek in late October with nothing but her trunk of books, and the quiet, unshakable certainty that she was going to make something of the place whether it asked her to or not. The settlement had been struggling, families scattered, no common organization, no school, no real sense of shared purpose. Within 2 weeks of her arrival, Mindy had called a community meeting. Within a month, she had organized working groups. Within 3 months, the schoolhouse was built. Every beam and board raised by community hands that Mindy had motivated, coordinated, and worked right alongside. But it was what she did in February that the entire settlement still talked about in lowered, reverent voices. Harlan Voss's representative, a thin, well-dressed man named Price who carried legal papers the way other men carried weapons, had ridden into Greystone Creek on a cold morning with the intention of pressuring the settlers into signing over their land claims. He had done it before in other settlements. He was practiced at it. He knew how to make frightened, isolated people feel that resistance was not only futile but foolish. He had not accounted for Mindy. She was standing on the steps of the schoolhouse when he rode in, as though she had been expecting him, which, Gerald told Matthew with quiet pride, she absolutely had been. For weeks prior, Mindy had been carefully gathering documents, writing letters to the Territorial Land Office, consulting with a traveling lawyer who had passed through in December, and compiling every signed land claim from every family in the settlement into a single bound folder that she held that morning under her arm like a teacher carrying a lesson plan. Price dismounted and began his carefully rehearsed speech about land boundaries and territorial authority. Mindy let him finish. Then she walked down the schoolhouse steps, crossed the distance between them with calm, unhurried steps, opened the folder, and held up the documents one by one. Every family's land claim. Legally filed, properly witnessed, officially registered with the Territorial Office 2 weeks prior through a postal contact Mindy had established in November. She looked at Price directly and said, in the same clear, measured voice she used to explain mathematics to 10-year-olds, "These people own this land." The Territorial Office agrees. The law agrees. I suggest you ride back to Mr. Voss and let him know that this particular creek is spoken for. Price stood in the morning cold for a long moment, looking at the documents, looking at Mindy, looking at the 24 settlers who had gathered silently behind her. Then he folded himself back onto his horse and rode out of Greystone Creek without a single word in reply. No gun was drawn, no voice was raised, not one act of force was required. The children watching from the schoolhouse window cheered so loudly that 2 birds left a nearby pine tree in startled flight. Gerald said he himself had to sit down on a fence post for a full minute simply to collect himself. Matthew heard all of this before he ever laid eyes on her. By the time Gerald pushed open the schoolhouse door, Matthew had already understood something fundamental, that while he had spent 8 months searching for Mindy, she had spent that same time becoming something even greater than the woman he remembered. She was at the chalkboard when the door opened, mid-sentence in a geography lesson, a piece of chalk in one hand and a look of total concentration on her face. 6 children sat before her in neat rows, slate boards in their laps. She turned at the sound of the door. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The children looked between the dusty, trail-worn man in the doorway and their teacher, whose composure, famously unshakable, had just visibly shifted into something softer and deeper than any of them had words for. "Class," Mindy said, her voice perfectly steady except for the single breath she took before speaking, "we will continue our lesson after lunch." The children filed out with the particular speed of young people who understand instinctively that the adults in the room need the space. Gerald pulled the door closed behind them from the outside with a quiet click. Matthew crossed the room in a few slow steps and stopped in front of her. Up close, she looked exactly like herself, and entirely new all at once. There was something settled in her eyes that had not been there before, the look of a person who has been tested at depth and has not found themselves wanting. He looked at the schoolhouse around them, the careful rows of desks, the books on the shelves, the maps pinned to the walls, the brass bell visible through the window above the door. Then he looked back at her. Slowly, he unbuckled his gun belt. He folded it with quiet deliberateness and set it down on the corner of her desk. "I believe," he said, "that I promised you something." Mindy looked at the gun belt on her desk. Then she looked at him. Then, for the first time in 8 months, she smiled the way she smiled at the white picket fence in Redrock Flats, fully, without reservation. "You're late," she said. "The road was long," he replied. "Was it worth it?" Matthew looked around the room once more. At everything she had built, at the community outside the window going about its bright April morning, at the brass bell above the door that called children to learning in the middle of the frontier wilderness. "I didn't find what I went looking for," he said quietly. "I found something better." They were married 3 weeks later in the small frontier church that Mindy had helped the community raise the previous winter. Gerald walked her down the aisle. The 6 children from her classroom sat in the front row, scrubbed and serious and deeply proud. Sheriff Dawes rode up from Redrock Flats with old Tess beside him, and Deputy Carlos arrived with wildflowers tied to his saddle that he presented to Mindy, with a bow that made the children laugh. Matthew stayed in Greystone Creek through the summer, helping the community finish what Mindy had started: stronger fences, a second well, a road properly graded all the way to the main territorial trail. Harlan Voss, faced with legal documents and a settlement that had organized itself beyond his reach, turned his attention elsewhere. Some battles, even powerful men eventually choose not to fight. On the last warm evening of summer, Matthew and Mindy rode out together to the top of the pine ridge above the settlement. Below them, the lights of Greystone Creek glowed warm and small against the vast darkening plain. A bell rang faintly in the evening air, the school bell, some child swinging it for the pure joy of the sound. Mindy reached across and took Matthew's hand without looking at him, the way people touch each other when words have become unnecessary. They rode side by side into the golden western horizon, not running from anything, not chasing anything, but moving together at an easy pace, toward a life they had both earned and built and chosen, on the far and beautiful edge of the wide American West.